My parents always had a clear favorite, and it was never me. Growing up, I learned to keep my expectations low because anything good automatically went to my brother, Daniel. He was the golden child, the one they bragged about endlessly, even when he did nothing to deserve it. I, on the other hand, was the one who needed to try harder, the one who never quite measured up. I used to tell myself that once I became an adult, things would even out. But life has this strange way of proving that family dynamics don't magically change just because you grow older. A few months ago, everything reached a breaking point. I had been working hard, paying my own bills, saving every little bit I could, and slowly building a stable life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I wasn't asking anyone for money or help. I had learned long ago that asking my parents for support only resulted in criticism. They would sneer, tell me I wasn't successful enough, that I didn't have Daniel's charm or intelligence. So I worked with what I had and tried to stay afloat. Then one afternoon, my mom called and casually mentioned something that left me frozen. They had just given Daniel $230,000 as a starter boost for his new business. Not a loan, not an investment, simply a gift. My jaw literally dropped. I thought I had misheard her. They had never given me a single dollar in my adult life. Not for college, not for emergencies, not even as a gesture of encouragement. And yet here they were, proudly giving Daniel nearly $250,000. When I asked why they never offered me anything close to that, my mother laughed. Actually laughed. She said, because you're not like Daniel. He has potential. You've always been a bit of a loser. My father chimed in, agreeing without hesitation. They said it so casually, as if calling their own child a loser was just a normal part of conversation. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't even angry at first, I was numb. It was as if everything I had suspected my entire life suddenly became painfully, undeniably real. They never believed in me. They never cared. They never saw value in my hard work. They only saw worth when it came wrapped in Daniel's name. For years, I held on to this tiny hope that maybe someday they would see me, appreciate me, or even just treat me with the same respect they gave him. But that phone call erased the last piece of hope I had. I remember sitting there, holding the phone, listening to them explain how Daniel deserved success, and how I should be happy for him instead of making everything about myself. My father said, maybe if you worked harder, we'd feel comfortable helping you. I wanted to scream that I had worked harder than either of them even realized. I wanted to tell them that I wasn't asking for money, I was asking for basic respect. But what was the point? They had already labeled me as less than. All I said was, okay. Then I hung up. After that day, I stopped calling them. No long explanation, no dramatic fight, no emotional goodbye. I simply stepped back. I didn't have the energy to keep proving myself to people who had already decided I wasn't good enough. I expected guilt to creep in, maybe even loneliness. But instead, I felt lighter. Free. Weeks passed, and the silence didn't feel like a burden, it felt like peace. No more cruel comparisons. No more casual insults disguised as advice. No more pretending everything was normal. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing their approval. Of course, they eventually noticed. My mother sent short messages asking why I wasn't calling. My father said I was being dramatic. And then, when Daniel's business started struggling, because he had no experience, no discipline, and no idea how to manage money, they suddenly wanted to talk. They wanted my advice, ironically, because I actually had experience in running things on my own. They expected me to step in and help clean up the mess. I didn't reply. I had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, and spoken down to. They never cared about my opinion when it came to my own life, yet now that their golden child was failing, my input suddenly mattered. The silence worked both ways. I stopped calling them, and I stopped giving them access to my life. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't bitter. I was simply done. There's a kind of strength in walking away quietly. It sends a message louder than any argument ever could. I'm doing fine now. Better, actually. My life isn't perfect, but it's mine, and I built it without anyone's approval or handouts. I'm proud of that. I don't know what the future holds with my parents, and I'm not sure if reconciliation is something I even want. What I do know is that sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is distance yourself from the people who hurt you the most, even when they're the ones who raised you. And in the quiet that followed, I discovered something I never expected. It wasn't me who had lost something, it was them. They gave my brother $230,000 and I wasn't supposed to react. That was the part that stunned me the most, not the amount of money, not the favoritism, not even the open disrespect. It was the expectation that I should smile, clap, and cheer for a moment that once again proved where I stood in my own family. I heard the news from my mother, who told me about it with the same tone someone might use when talking about the weather. A casual, almost indifferent delivery, as if she didn't just confirm what I had suspected for years, that I was never going to be anything more than a background character in their narrative. For as long as I can remember, my brother Eric has been the center of their world. He didn't have to earn it. He simply existed, and somehow that was enough for them. He was the one they praised, the one they believed in, the one they poured their money, time, and affection into. I was the one they lectured, the one they corrected, the one they told to do better next time. It was a rhythm I had grown used to, a script they had perfected over the years, but hearing the number, 230,000, gave that old pain a new edge. I remember sitting on the phone, silent, trying to make sense of the words. My mother didn't stop to check if I was okay. She didn't pause to consider how I might feel. She simply went on explaining how they wanted to give Eric a real chance, how he deserved a strong start in life, how he had big dreams and needed support. My name wasn't mentioned once, as if I had no dreams, no needs, no life worth investing in. When I finally asked why they had never done anything like that for me, there was no hesitation, only cruelty dressed in the same casual tone. My mother told me I wasn't successful enough to justify such an investment. My father added that I had never shown promise, and then came the line that stuck with me like a thorn: Eric is the one with potential. You've always been average. Average. That was the polite version, apparently, because a minute later she called me a loser who should be grateful they never had to bail me out. I hung up the phone feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath me. It wasn't just disappointment. It was a deep, hollow ache that came from finally accepting something I didn't want to believe. I had always hoped that maybe one day they would see me differently. Maybe one day they would recognize the hard work I put into everything, how I built my life carefully, responsibly, without leaning on anyone. But that phone call killed the last bit of hope I had been carrying. For a few days, I replayed their words over and over, not because I believed them but because they were so unexpectedly sharp. I had always known they preferred Eric, but hearing it stated so blatantly, so unapologetically, made it feel like my entire childhood suddenly made sense. The dismissive comments, the criticism disguised as advice, the way they belittled my accomplishments while celebrating Eric's smallest achievements, it all fit together like pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. Then something inside me shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe clarity, maybe self-respect that had been waiting years to surface. Whatever it was, it changed everything. I stopped calling them, not in anger, not as punishment, but as protection. I couldn't keep showing up to a place where I was treated as less than human. I couldn't keep handing over my emotional energy to people who saw no value in me. Days turned into weeks, and the silence grew into something unexpectedly comforting. For the first time in my life, I felt distance, not cold, not painful, just peaceful. I wasn't waiting for their approval anymore. I wasn't shrinking myself to avoid their disapproval. I wasn't comparing my life to Eric's or trying to catch up to expectations that were never meant for me. I was living quietly, steadily, and freely. Eventually they reached out, confused by my silence. My mother sent short messages, each one more irritated than the last. My father tried guilt, telling me I was being childish. Eric didn't contact me at all, probably too busy burning through the money he'd been handed. When I didn't respond, the messages changed tone. Suddenly they were concerned, not about me, of course, but about Eric's business, which wasn't doing well. He needed advice, they said. He needed help, they said. And somehow, they believed I was the one who could fix it. There was a strange irony in that. The child they called a loser, the child they claimed lacked potential, was suddenly the one they wanted to rely on when their favored son stumbled. But I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. If they couldn't value me when they believed I had nothing to offer, they didn't deserve access to me now that they needed something. In the silence, I learned something powerful. Walking away wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a declaration of worth. I wasn't rejecting them, I was choosing myself. And in choosing myself, I realized I didn't need their validation, their approval, or even their presence. What I needed was peace, and for the first time in my life, I finally had it. After weeks of silence from my parents, I began to notice something unusual. The messages from my mother, once sharp and full of irritation, slowly shifted into uneasy politeness. My father's tone changed from demanding to hesitant. Neither of them mentioned the insults they had thrown at me or the way they dismissed my entire existence. Instead, they danced around the subject, sending vague texts like, "Hope you're well," and "We haven't heard from you." Normally I would have fallen for this sudden warmth, thinking maybe things were finally changing. But this time, it simply felt like an old trick I had seen too many times before. I knew something had to be wrong, and I suspected that something had to do with Eric. He had always been reckless with money, believing confidence was enough to cover up incompetence. My parents supported every foolish decision he made, telling him he was destined for greatness even when he had no plan, no patience, and no work ethic. So when they handed him $230,000, I already knew how that story was going to end. It wasn't even a matter of if, it was a matter of when. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. One evening, after nearly a month of their polite messages, my mother finally cracked and sent me a long paragraph. She didn't mention the insults, didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge the hurt they caused. Instead, she wrote about how Eric's business was failing, how he had mismanaged funds, how he owed people money, and how he was overwhelmed and needed support. She ended the message with a line that made me stop reading for a moment. "We thought you could talk to him. He respects your responsibility." It was almost laughable. For years, they had painted me as the irresponsible one, the one with no direction, the one who didn't deserve their help. Yet suddenly, when the golden child had crashed and burned, responsibility was the word they were using for me. It was strange how quickly their vocabulary changed when they were desperate. I didn't answer the message. I wasn't cruel about it, I just didn't have anything left to give. I wasn't going to be the emergency parachute for a family that treated me like dead weight until they needed something. For once in my life, I wasn't stepping in to fix a problem I didn't cause. A week passed before I heard from Eric directly. His message was short. "Mom said you're mad at them. Can we talk?" I didn't reply, not because I wanted him to suffer but because I knew how these conversations usually went. He would pretend we were close, pretend to understand, pretend to apologize, but only because he needed something. And once he got it, the cycle would reset. He would go back to being the chosen one, and I would go back to being the disappointment they never defended. Silence became my answer, and the more I held onto it, the more I realized how much of my life had been shaped by chasing approval from people who didn't even see me clearly. My parents had raised Eric to believe he deserved everything simply for existing. They had raised me to believe I deserved nothing, no matter how hard I worked. It wasn't about money, it was about how they saw value, how they assigned worth, how they convinced me for years that I would never be enough. One evening, while I was cooking dinner, my phone buzzed again. This time my father called. I stared at the screen, letting it ring. It rang again, and again. Then a message appeared, and for the first time since the silence began, it sounded almost honest. "We didn't treat you right." It wasn't an apology, not really. It was more like an admission whispered through gritted teeth. Maybe they finally understood why I stopped calling. Maybe they were forced to notice because their favorite child had disappointed them while the child they underestimated was the only stable one. Maybe they realized that respect should have never been conditional. I didn't answer right away. In fact, I didn't answer that day at all. I sat with their words, letting the weight of them drift through all the years of imbalance, favoritism, and quiet hurt that had shaped me. I wasn't rushing back into their arms, and I wasn't planning a dramatic reunion. I was simply acknowledging that things were changing, not because they wanted change, but because I did. Eventually, weeks later, I sent a short message: "I need time." Nothing more, nothing less. And for the first time in my life, they didn't push back. They didn't argue, didn't guilt trip, didn't complain. They simply accepted it. Maybe they finally understood that love without respect is hollow. Maybe they realized that their words mattered more than they ever pretended. Or maybe they knew they had pushed me too far, and the distance was no longer something I was afraid of. As for me, I wasn't angry anymore. Just free. I didn't know whether things would ever truly fix themselves, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never let anyone, family or not, decide my worth again.